channel. This is Majid from MediStudent Help. In this video, we're going to be covering the antiarrhythmic drugs. Now, I know this topic may sound very tough and difficult, but I can actually promise you that after finishing this video, you're going to see like how simple it is. You don't need to go in very deep details in what each drug does and stuff. Just know the very important points about each and you will be fine, believe me. Okay, so let's get started. Now, the antiarrhythmic drugs can be classified according to this guy, however you're gonna pronounce it, but it is Vaughan Williams classification. So it's classified to a class 1 antiarrhythmic drugs that are the sodium channel blockers, class 2 the beta receptor antagonist, and the class 3 the potassium channel blockers, and the class 4 the calcium channel blockers. Now, it is very important that you watch the first video about the physiology and pathophysiology of the arrhythmias and the heart rates and stuff that I have uploaded earlier, because otherwise you're gonna find it difficult to understand. Okay, now let's get started with the class 1. I'm not gonna go in minor details in these, so let's just go in deep details one by one. Now, so the first class of the antiarrhythmic drug is the sodium channel blockers. Why would we block the sodium channel blockers and the sodium channels, and where did we have them? So let's remind ourselves. Where did we mention the sodium channels, the voltage gated sodium channels? As you remember, they were responsible for the upstroke phase, which was a phase that represented the depolarization of the cardiac muscles. So as you see in this figure, this is the cardiac muscle depolarization cycle. And in this phase, which is phase 4, it was the resting phase. And then we had the depolarization, and we said that the depolarization in the cardiac muscle is made by the sodium upstroke phase, which means that there was a voltage gated sodium channels that have allowed the sodium influx into the cell, and it has caused this depolarization. And then the repolarization started by the potassium efflux, right? So the potassium started leaving, and then the plateau phase, and then the potassium left the cell more, leading to the repolarization back to the resting phase. Now, what I want you to remember here also that I have mentioned that the sodium channels, so the voltage gated sodium channels, they have three forms. They have the open active form, the closed inactive form, and the closed resting form, right? So we said that during the depolarization phase, the upstroke phase, they are going to be open, they are active, right? The sodium voltage gated channels, right? And during the repolarization at the beginning, actually, right, like let's say from here till here, they are closed and inactive, meaning if another impulse comes, they are not gonna open. They are totally inactive. There is nothing is gonna open them. Okay, and we said that during phase 4, which means a resting phase, the muscle is gonna be relaxing, and the voltage gated sodium channels are gonna be closed, but they are resting phase, right? So let me just remind you really fast with this. So as you remember, we said that, for example, um, okay, so this was here. Oh my God. Okay, forget it. So I wanted to draw you the three forms of the sodium channels. If you didn't see it in my previous video, please just go and check it out. So we said that three forms. The open form is in the depolarization form, and then it is going to be closed and inactive after after the active form. Okay, and during the repolarization, these closed inactive forms are gonna start converting into closed resting form. Okay, so the number of the sodium channels that are in the resting phase is increasing as the membrane potential is getting more negative. What does like the membrane potential is getting more negative mean? It means that we are doing what? Repolarization. So we can replace this sentence by repolarization, right? So the number of the sodium channels that are in the resting phase is increasing as we do repolarization. So if we had at this point, for example, 10 voltage gated sodium channels in the resting form, here we're gonna have, for example, 500, and here we're gonna have 1000, and then here we're gonna have million, for example. Okay, so the number is increasing with the repolarization. Now, the maximum number of the resting closed channels, this number, the maximum number, was achieved at what? It was achieved at minus 90 millivolt. Okay, as you see here, it was almost minus 90 millivolt, which means that at this membrane potential, all the voltage gated sodium channels were in the closed resting phase. That means that if an impulse comes, they are able to open, right? Okay, now to start the depolarization, we must have enough number of the sodium channels that are in the resting closed phase. This is very important. Okay? So this means that let's say that the muscle didn't repolarize till minus 90 and it only repolarized till minus 60. Okay? Would that be enough number of closed resting channels to start a new depolarization? No, it wouldn't be enough. Okay? That's the point here. So to start a new depolarization, we must have enough number of sodium channels that are in the resting closed phase. Okay. Now, let's apply our drugs. We said that the first category of the antiarrhythmic drugs are the drugs that are gonna block the sodium channels, right? So now, when we apply the sodium channel blocking drugs, the number of the channels that are available for the initiation of the depolarization, which actually means that they are in the resting phase, is gonna decrease. Okay, so that's the problem here. Now, when we apply the sodium channel blocking drugs, the number of the closed resting channels is going to decrease, okay, because they are blocked. Now, when a new impulse comes, will we be able to initiate a new depolarization? No, because again, we're not going to have enough number. We're not going to have all of the sodium channels in the resting phase because of the drug. Now, so what can we do? How can we increase the number of the resting sodium channels again in the presence of the drug? Now, to answer this question, we should look at the figure again and see how did we reach the maximum number of the closed resting phase sodium channels. We said that the maximum number of the resting closed channels was achieved at minus 90. So it was achieved by repolarization, by making the membrane potential more negative. Okay, now we have applied the drug, okay, and it has blocked a lot of what closed resting channels. Okay, now so the number of the closed resting channels at minus 90, instead of 1 million, let's say it is 500,000. Okay? Now, what can we do to achieve the 1 million resting phase voltage gated sodium channels? We must make the membrane potential even more negative. So instead of minus 90, we should try to achieve what? For example, let's say it was like this, same thing. We have to go, for example, till minus 110. Okay, minus 110 in order to achieve what? 1 million, let's say 1 million resting phase voltage gated sodium channels. Okay, do you get it? Let's say it again. So we said that the number of the sodium channels that are in the resting phase is increasing as the membrane potential is getting more negative, which means that the cell was what? Repolarizing. Okay? Now, when we apply the sodium channel blocking drugs, the number of the available resting phase sodium channels is going to decrease because some of them are blocked by the drug, right? And the number that is available to start a new depolarization is small, so we can't start a new depolarization. So we have to achieve a higher number of the sodium channels, okay, even in the presence of the drug. How can we do that? We repolarize more. We make the membrane potential even more negative to reach, for example, instead of minus 90, minus 100, for example, minus 100, okay? Now, so in this case, we're gonna increase the number of the resting sodium channels again, and then a new action potential is gonna start. So we will be able to start a new depolarization and then repolarization again. Okay, that's the point. All right, now let's get back here. So we said, how can we increase the number of the resting sodium channels again in the presence of the drug? By making the membrane potential even more negative. How can we do that? By ejecting more potassium, because the repolarization was what? Was an outflux of potassium. So how can we make the membrane potential more negative? We have to do more potassium outflux, which means we're gonna repolarize more than normal. Okay, what does that mean? That we need more time. Okay, this is very important. Okay, we need more time for ejecting potassium, which means longer time for repolarization. Okay, so these two words are very important. So we need more time for ejecting potassium, which means longer time for repolarization. Okay, what does longer time for repolarization mean? This means that the refractory period of the muscle is prolonging. Now, let me explain this in a more clear way. Now, so we said that in phase 4 here, which was the resting phase, the sodium channels were in the resting closed phase. And then this is the depolarization where they have opened and then they closed in the inactive form. They are not able to open. And then they were converting to the resting phase again during the repolarization, right? Now, when we applied the drug, we needed to reach a even more negative membrane potential in order to achieve a higher number of the available resting phase sodium channels. And we said in order to do that, we have to eject more potassium. So here potassium was leaving, right? Now, so potassium was leaving the cell, okay, all the time. And you can see here that the repolarization period is prolonged because we needed more potassium outflux, right? Okay, so the refractory period prolonged. Now, let's see how was the muscle during each phase. So in the resting phase, the muscle was resting, it wasn't contracting. Now, during the depolarization phase, the muscle was what? The muscle was contracting. Now, in the repolarization phase, the muscle is actually in refractory period. So when we prolong the repolarization phase, this means we prolong the refractory period of the muscle. So the fat, okay, forget about this for now. So we said again, the muscle is resting in the resting phase, contracting in the depolarization, and it is in refractory period during the repolarization. And when we apply the sodium channel blockers, what we did is that the refractory period got prolonged, right? How did that happen? Because we prolonged the repolarization, because we needed more time to eject more potassium outside of the cell. Okay, so this is the first thing. The first thing that the sodium channel blockers do. Now, the second thing that this upstroke phase, that was representing the depolarization that has happened as a function of the sodium voltage gated channels, okay, this was responsible for transmitting action potential to adjacent cells. So this means that the cell is active, it is contracting, and you know that the cardiac muscles, they are transmitting the action potentials to the next muscle right next to it. So let's say that this was a muscle, a cardiac muscle, okay, and here is another cardiac muscle. Okay, now when this muscle goes through this depolarization phase, okay, So this means that it is contracting, and this means that it is going to transmit the action potential to the adjacent cell, to the cell right next to it. Okay? Now, if we make this upstroke phase even slower, like this for example, because we blocked the sodium channels, okay, what is going to happen here is that the transmission of the action potential from this cell to this cell is going to be slower, right? So this is going to slow the heart rate. The faster the cardiac muscle depolarizes, which means the faster this upstroke phase is, the faster it's gonna transmit next action potential to the adjacent cell. So let's reverse the sentence. The slower the cardiac muscle depolarizes, which means that the upstroke phase was like this because we blocked some sodium channels, then the slower it is gonna transmit next action potential to adjacent cell. And that's how we're gonna manage to prevent arrhythmias in these patients using such drugs. So using this drug um, will slow it down, right? So using these drugs are gonna slow the heart rate down. Okay, so that's the point here. So far we talked about the mechanism of action of the voltage-gated sodium channel blockers drugs, which was the first class of the von William classification. We said two things. Due to the blocking of the sodium channels, we needed to repolarize more in order to reach even more negative membrane potential in order to achieve the normal number or a higher number of the sodium channels in the resting phase, right? So this was the first thing. And we needed to prolong the repolarization that led to a prolongation of the refractory period of the muscle. And the second action was that we decreased or we slowed down the upstroke phase, which was the depolarization phase of the cardiac muscle, because we blocked sodium channels, and this has led to decrease the velocity by which the action potentials are transmitted to the adjacent cells. I hope you got that. So, in addition to that, by mechanisms that are not really understood, and unrelated to blocking the fast sodium channels, the class 1 antiarrhythmic drugs, they can suppress abnormal automaticity by decreasing the slope of the phase for the SDD, which is generated by the pacemaker current. Now let me remind you here. So we said here this was the SDD, right? We said that it depends on the minimum diastolic potential and the slope and the activation threshold. Now, what I want you to understand is if we were to make a line, okay, no, if we were to do this, if we were to make a line, what the hell? Sorry, yeah. Now, if we were to make a line like this, what does this mean to you? This means that the slope is sharper. When the slope is sharper, this means that we can reach the activation threshold even faster, right? Which means that the automaticity or the heart rate is going to be higher. Now, what if the slope was like this? If the slope was like this, so the slope is decreased, this means that we're going to reach the activation threshold later, and the automaticity is going to decrease, right? Which means that the heart rate is going to decrease. Now, let's see what did the drugs do here. We said that in ununderstood, it is not understood and unrelated to blocking the fast sodium channels, these drugs are going to suppress the automaticity by decreasing the slope. So it has decreased the slope, meaning that the heart rate is going to decrease. This is going to help to prevent the arrhythmia, to stop the arrhythmia. So this is the third way by which these guys are functioning. Okay, now this is the third form. Now, so blocking the sodium channels is a decrease in conduction velocity in non-nodal tissue. Okay, now therefore, blocking sodium channels reduces the velocity of action potential transmission within the heart that I already mentioned. Reduced conduction velocity. What does that mean? Negative dromotropy, negative conduction, right? This can serve as an important mechanism of suppressing tachycardias that are caused by abnormal conduction, for example, re-entry. Okay, now before going in details in what drugs do we have in this category, I want you to know what does use-dependent drugs mean? What does state-dependent drugs mean? Now, use-dependent, okay, use-dependent. These guys are the drugs that have higher affinity for the active state of the sodium channels. For the active state. What was the active state of the sodium channel? It was the open state. So these drugs are gonna block the sodium channels that are in the active state. When do we have the sodium channels in the active state? In the depolarization phase, in the upstroke phase, right? Now, the state dependent, they have higher affinity for the inactive state of the sodium channels. Now, so let me remind you again. We said that this is the depolarization of the cardiac muscle. During this phase, which was the depolarization phase, we said that the sodium channels are going to be open, right? Because they were responsible for this upstroke phase anyway. Now, when we use a drug that is use dependent, this means that this drug is going to come and block the channels here, these channels that are already open, okay? While the state dependent drug is going to block the drugs that are in the inactive form. When did we have the inactive form? We had it right there. After they are open, they are gonna close in the inactive form, which means that they can't be opened again. So these guys are gonna block here. Okay? Now, what does this mean to you? If the muscle is contracting more, if the muscle had a tachycardia, then most of the sodium channels are going to be active because they are going to be working all the time because there is tachycardia, which means that we will have a higher number of the active form of the sodium channels, right? So in this case, if we used a use-dependent drug, it is going to function very well. Okay, let's compare it to a heart that was ischemic. Ischemic heart means that not enough oxygen, which means that the contraction of the muscles is going to be decreased, right? So there is not going to be tachycardia, but rather maybe bradycardia. And that's why in this case, if we use the state-dependent drug, we're going to find that most of the channels are in the inactive form anyway. So we're going to function much better because most of the channels are going to be in the inactive form because of the ischemia. Okay? Now, the other thing that I want you to know before going to the drugs details, that the longer the time binding means a stronger effect. So if the drug is blocking the sodium channel for a longer time, this means that it has a stronger effect. Okay? Now, let's get started with what drugs do we have in the first class. So, class 1, the sodium channel blockers, is classified into three subclasses. Class 1A, and then we're going to go to class 1B, and then we're going to go to class 1C. Now, let's get started with the class 1A. Now, just ignore this sentence in brown and let's go to details. Class 1A, they have a moderate inhibition of phase 0 depolarization. What was phase 0 depolarization? It was this phase, right? So they have a moderate inhibition. Why moderate inhibition? Because it only blocks for 1 second. Okay, only for 1 second. The time of binding to the channel is only 1 second. So this is the so-called the constant of dissociation. Now, because it only binds 1 second, it has a moderate function. Let's compare it to class 1b. Class 1b has a slight inhibition. Why slight? Because it binds even for a shorter time, so it is weaker. Let's see class 1c. Class 1c is strong. Why? Because it blocks for a longer time. Do you get it? So what I'm trying to say is that the longer the constant of dissociation is, the stronger the drug is, right? So the constant of dissociation is 1 second here, so it can block only moderately. Okay, now the more important thing here is that these class 1A drugs, they don't only block the sodium channels, but they also have an additional potassium channel blocking that is going to prolong the repolarization. Now, let's see here. If we block the potassium channels, some of them, not all of them, of course, you can't block all of them at once. When you apply a drug, you don't block all the channels, you block some of them till some degree, right? Now, if you apply the class 1A, you're gonna block the sodium channels that were making this depolarizing phase, but they are gonna also block some potassium channels that were responsible for the repolarization, which means that we will need even longer time for the repolarization. So it's gonna be even like this, for example. Okay? So we're gonna need longer time to do the repolarization. Now, this is a good thing because if we prolong the repolarization, we said that the muscle is going to be in what phase? In the refractory phase, which means that the heart rate is going to what? It is going to decrease. So the good thing that additional reduction of automaticity and increase in the refractory period. Okay, but it's a bad thing. Why? Because when I explained the types of arrhythmias, we said that if there was a QT prolongation in the a QT prolongation, like when you see a P wave and then a Q, R, S, T, okay? So if this period from the start of the Q wave till the end of the T wave is prolonged, this means that there is a higher chance for an early after depolarization type of arrhythmia, which is a Torsades de Pointes, okay? So this is the same thing. If we prolong the repolarization phase here, this means we're prolonging the QT in the ECG, and this is gonna increase the chance of developing an EAD, which is the early after depolarization. We said that the early after depolarization develops during the plateau phase, right? So it's like this. Another impulse is gonna come here and cause arrhythmia if we prolong this um, if we prolong this repolarization period. Okay, now the other thing that I want you to know about a class 1A is that they are use dependents, which means that they have a higher affinity to what type of sodium channels? The active form, the open form, which means that if the drug is in tachycardia, these drugs are gonna function even better. Okay, now where do we use this class? We use it for the supraventricular arrhythmias. Okay, now focus on the red color. Okay, these are very important things. So if you were to skip anything, well, you can skip some shit, but I mean, don't skip the red ones. Okay, now let's see what drugs do we have in this category. Now, the first drug is the quinidine. This quinidine is a tricky, dirty drug. Why is it dirty? Because we said that it belongs to class 1. What does that mean to you? It means that it blocks sodium channel, it blocks potassium channel, but the quinidine also blocks alpha receptors and they block the muscarinic receptor as well. Now, let's see what happens if you block the muscarinic receptor. You don't have any vagal tone anymore on the heart, which means that you're gonna have a positive chronotropy, so the heart rate is gonna increase, and the dromotropy, the conduction is gonna increase. Is this good when you're trying to solve a problem like arrhythmia? Of course not. If a patient is suffering from arrhythmia and the drug has caused increase in the heart rate and increase in the conduction, this means that the patient may develop even a worse arrhythmia. Okay, so this is a paradoxical heart effect of the quinidine. Now, moreover, it has extracardiac side effects. What are they? It is diarrhea, for example, and muscle weakness. How can we explain these? Because there is no vagal tone, okay? And the alpha block, and I don't know, whatever. So, diarrhea and muscle weakness, immunothrombocytopenia, photophobia, and synchronism. Now, these purple ones are very important, okay? Now, so synchronism of the quinidine, it is like intoxication. You should Google it. I don't know how to explain it really, but these are the extracardiac side effects. So if I were you and I wanted to memorize just one extra cardiac side effect, I would memorize the synchronism, maybe also the immunothrombocytopenia. Okay, the quinidine is also used orally. Okay, now let's see. If I was freaked out and I didn't want to memorize a lot about this topic, I would say, okay, so we have the quinidine, it belongs to class 1A, and it also blocks the alpha receptor, muscarinic receptor, causes paradoxical heart effect, and extracardiac side effects like the synchronism, and it is given orally, and it is not even important to mention that it's given orally anyway. Okay, now the next drug that we have is the prokinamide. The prokinamide is the best drug in this category, although it is not really used, but whatever. Now, the prokinamide is the best for the supraventricular arrhythmia because we said that the class 1A are used for the supraventricular arrhythmia. So it is the best in its job. Okay? Now, the important thing about the prokinamide that the elimination of it happens by acetylation. Acetylation happens in the liver. Now, like we people are different from each other. Some people are fast acetylators and other people are slow acetylators. Now, what happens if a person was a slow acetylator and they were given prokinamide? This is going to lead to SLE like syndrome. This is very important. Always, if the drug is eliminated by acetylation and the person who has received this drug was a slow acetylator, they are highly likely to develop SLE syndrome. Okay? Now, so they are going to develop SLE like syndrome, and in fast acetylators, to set the point is there is a risk of proarrhythmia. Okay, the procainamide is used intramuscularly or intravenously for emergency. This is the important thing about it. Now, the third drug is the disopyramide. Now, the disopyramide is also an anti-muscarinic, so it's basically like the quinidine, but not that much because the quinidine also blocks the alpha receptors. Now, the disopyramide, it only blocks the muscarinic receptor, in addition, of course, to blocking the sodium and the potassium channels. And it has a negative ionotropy on the heart, which means that the contractility of the heart is going to decrease. Okay? Now, so I know you're kind of lost right now. Let me remind you again of what we have been saying. So we started saying that we had four classes according to Vaughan William classification. We said sodium channel blockers was our first class and it has A, B, and C. Okay? Now, we explained how do the sodium channel blockers work. We said that they are going to block the sodium channels that are in that are forming the depolarization form, and the number of the resting channels is going to decrease. So we needed to make the membrane potential even more negative in order to achieve a higher number of the resting phase sodium channels. And in order to do that, we have done what a potassium outflux for a longer time. So we prolonged the repolarization, which means that we prolong the refractory period of the muscle. The other effect of the drug was that we are making the upstroke phase slower than normal, and when it's slower, this means that the conduction of the action potential to the adjacent cardiomyocyte is slower, which means that the heart rate is going to decrease. And the third effect was to suppress the SDD slope, decrease the SDD slope. This means that we suppress the automaticity, we decrease the heart rate even more. Okay? And then we said that in class 1A we have three drugs, the quinidine, the prokinamide, and the disopyramide. And the most important stuff that they are moderately acting because they block only for 1 second, and additionally they block the potassium channel, which means they are going to prolong the repolarization, and they are use dependent. So if the heart is in tachycardia, they are going to function better, and they are used for the supraventricular tachycardias, and most of them have antimuscarinic action, including the quinidine, the prokinamide, and the disopyramide. So even the prokinamide has antimuscarinic function, but it is much less pronounced than that in the quinidine and the disopyramide. Okay, so these are the keywords that you have to know about this class. There is no way you are skipping any of these. Okay, now Let's start with the class 1b. In class 1b, um, it has a slight inhibition, as I already mentioned, and we said that it is a slight because it only blocks for 0.1 second. Okay. Now, additionally, it slightly shortens the repolarization. This is not important, you don't have to know it, okay? Now, the most important thing I think in this class that they have a state-dependent action. We said that the state-dependent that they are able to act on the inactive. Okay, so the channels that are inactive, they are closed. They are gonna block them when they are closed. And we said that the channels are gonna be closed if the heart was in hypoxia. Okay, so mainly in the ventricular fiber. Now, it is used mainly in the ventricular tachyarrhythmia caused by ischemic heart disease. Now, the drug, the most important drug here, or the prodrug of this category, is the lidocaine. Now, the lidocaine has an important function because it has a negative dromotropy, so the conduction is going to decrease, and negative ionotropy, the contractility of the heart is going to decrease. Is this good for us to decrease the conduction and the contractility? Of course, because the arrhythmia, in the arrhythmia, there is an enhanced conduction. So if we decrease the conduction, we're going to try to manage this arrhythmia. Now, the bad thing about the lidocaine that it has an extra cardiac side effect, for example, paresthesia or tremors or convulsions. Okay, now the very, very important thing to mention about the lidocaine is going to be that it has a very high first pass metabolism. It is very famous in pharmacology that lidocaine is an example of the drugs that have an extensive first pass metabolism. Now, as you remember, if a drug has a very high first pass metabolism, what does that mean? It means that we can't give it orally because the dose is going to be decreased very much. So we have to use it what in an IV form, intravenously form. And it is used usually in emergency. It would do its function within 1 to 2 hours. And it is used to treat ventricular arrhythmias associated with acute myocardial infarction. Now, why why do we use it for ventricular arrhythmias associated with acute myocardial infarction? Because acute myocardial infarction, it represents ischemic heart. Now, what does ischemic heart mean? It means that the sodium channels are in the inactive form, inactive closed form, okay? And these drugs are state dependent, so they can block the channels that are in the inactive form, okay? So that's why they are very important to be used if the patient developed ventricular arrhythmia after AMI. Now, we have two more drugs in this category, the mixilitine and the tokainide. You don't need to memorize more about these drugs other than that they are given orally and they have a longer action. These drugs are basically derivatives of the lidocaine, okay? So the difference between them and the lidocaine that they can be given orally, their first pass metabolism is much less and they act for a longer time than 2 hours, okay? Now, so in this category, the class 1b, what did we say? The very important things to mention that it has a slight function on the phase 0 depolarization because it only blocks for 0.1 second. The other thing that they are state dependent. They block the drugs that the channels that are in the inactive form. We have a high number of the inactive channels in the hypoxic tissues, which means that we use these drugs for ventricular arrhythmias with AMI. Okay, ventricular arrhythmias with AMI. So very, very easy. Just don't go in details. Just be superficial. And okay, so this information should be really enough for the exam. Now, class 1C. A class 1C is the last class in class 1. It has a strong inhibition. Now, why strong? Because it blocks for a long time. It blocks for 10 seconds. Now, the bad thing about the class 1C that they are pro-arrhythmogenic. What does pro-arrhythmogenic mean? That basically we're giving a drug to stop the arrhythmia, but the drug itself might cause arrhythmia. You see, it's tricky. So we call it a pro-arrhythmic drug. Okay? So slower conduction may activate latent re-entry, a pro-arrhythmogenic effect. and they are use dependent, so they act even better if the heart was in what? In tachycardia. Now, how do they function? They have a strong negative dromotropy and ionotropy, like what? Like when we spoke about the lidocaine. So, negative on the conduction and on the contractility of the heart. Okay, what drugs do we have here? We have the flecainide and the propafenone. The flecainide, it is used in resistant case of the supraventricular tachyarrhythmia, okay, like atrial fibrillation, for example. And it may cause a serious ventricular arrhythmia in patients who have experienced acute myocardial infarction or pre-existing ventricular ectopy. Okay, so you should know that the flecainide shouldn't be given to a patient who has had acute myocardial infarction or pre-existing ventricular ectopy. Okay, because there is a higher chance to develop ventricular arrhythmia that can be lethal, right? So the flecainide is also given orally. Not so important to mention, but yeah. Now, the propafenone, on the other hand, unlike the flecainide, that it has an additional function by blocking some potassium channels and beta receptors, and it is used orally. That's all what you should know. I don't have more to talk about this class. Let's revise it. So we said that the class 1C, it has a strong function because it blocks for 10 seconds. And it is use dependent because it blocks the channels that are active, they are open. And it has, what is negative? It has a negative function on the conduction and on the contractility. And it is used for atrial fibrillation, supraventricular tachyarrhythmias, and it is the most pro-arrhythmogenic, which means that it is the drug that would cause arrhythmia mostly to the patient. And we said that this is going to be very serious if the patient had what? A previous acute myocardial infarction or a pre-existing ventricular ectopy. Now, let's move to class 2, the beta 1 receptor antagonist. Now, let's see how do these guys work. Now you know that the adrenergic receptors in general, adrenergic receptors, so the alpha receptors, the beta receptors in the heart, and mainly beta receptors, you know, if there was a sympathetic activation, it is gonna act on the beta 1 receptor in the heart, right? What would this lead to if the beta 1 receptor was activated? It would lead to positive ionotropy and positive chronotropy, bathmotropy, and dermotropy. So, if we block the adrenergic receptor, and here we're talking about the beta 1 receptor, this is going to lead to negative chronotropy, the heart rate is going to decrease, negative ionotropy, bathmotropy, and dermotropy. Okay? Now, let's see how does that happen. So the beta 1 receptor antagonists, they are gonna diminish the slope of the SDD. So as I showed you before, that if we decrease the slope of the SDD, this means that the heart rate is gonna decrease, right? So this is gonna reduce the automaticity and the heart rate. Okay. Now, and a slow AV conduction, which is the negative dermotropy, right? Negative dromotropy, not dermotropy, dromotropy, yeah? So slow AV conduction, negative dromotropic effect, and increased AV node refractoriness. Okay, I never got this, but I mean it inhibits the re-entry, that's enough, because it is slowing the AV conduction so much. That's what I know. Now, it is very good in case of the supraventricular tachycardia. Why? Because let's say that the patient had atrial fibrillation or atrial flutter. You know that the SA node, for example, would be firing for, let's say, 300 beats per minute. Now, if we slow down the conduction at the AV node, this means that the ventricular rate may still be less than 150, because not all of the impulses that are coming from the SA node are being transmitted through the AV node. And when we even slow it even more, this is gonna decrease the ventricular rate, which is very important to us. Okay? Now, the other thing that the beta blockers can also prevent the early after depolarization that used to happen in phase 2 and the delayed after depolarization that used to happen in phase 4. Now, the drug, and it is the drug choice in ventricular arrhythmia. Why is that? Okay, let's see here. Why would we use the beta blockers in ventricular arrhythmia? You know that the ventricular arrhythmia is a very, very serious situation because the patient may die within seconds. So, beta blockers can protect against sudden cardiac death caused by ventricular fibrillation. That's why we always have to use beta blockers if the patient went in ventricular arrhythmia because it can protect from this sudden cardiac death. Okay. Now, so we said that first of all, it was used for supraventricular tachycardias, and second of all, it is used in case of ventricular arrhythmia because it protects from the sudden cardiac death, and the third thing, that it is very effective in the catecholamine-induced arrhythmia. Now, what do we mean with the catecholamine-induced arrhythmia? For example, if the patient had pheochromocytoma, you remember the pheochromocytoma is a tumor of the adrenal medulla, which means a lot of adrenaline was produced from there. So, this so much sympathetic activation can lead to arrhythmia. So, in this case, we can manage it using adrenergic blockers or hyperthyroidism or amphetamine overdose. You're gonna learn about amphetamine later on. Now, what drugs do we have in this category? We have the metoprolol, atenolol, betaxolol, bisoprolol, nebivolol, and celiprolol. You guys should know these drugs like by heart. Yeah. Okay. So let's go over this category once again. We said that the beta 1 receptor antagonists, they are important because they are going to decrease the slope of the SDD, meaning they are going to decrease the automaticity. In addition, they have negative chronotropy, inotropy, bathmotropy, and dromotropy, right? They prevent the EAD, the DAD, and they are used for the supraventricular, so the atrial fibrillation, and the ventricular fibrillation, in addition to the catecholamine-induced arrhythmias. Very easy, very simple. Okay? Now, let's see the third class. This is an interesting class of antiarrhythmic drugs. It is the so-called the potassium channel blockers. Okay? Now, the potassium channel blockers. Now, let's think about it. Where do we have potassium channels? So, as you remember again, we said that the potassium was responsible for the repolarization phase. If we block the potassium channels that are making the repolarization, this means that the repolarization is gonna take what? It is gonna take a longer time than normal, right? Now, so blocking the potassium channels is responsible for repolarization phase 3. So this is going to be prolonged, okay, and this is going to lead to reduced automaticity. But we said that whenever we prolong this means that the QT in the ECG is prolonged, right? If we prolong the QT in the ECG, this means that there is a risk of what? There is a risk of arrhythmia, the torset de pointes, okay? Keep that in mind always. If blocking the potassium channels means two things. The first thing, that we're going to prolong the repolarization period, which is going to decrease the automaticity. On the other hand, prolonging the repolarization period means that the QT is going to be prolonged, and if it is prolonged, there is a risk of the early after depolarization. Okay, now the most pro-arrhythmogenic drugs, by the way, class 1C and then 1A, 1B, and the class 3. So what I wanted to mention here is that these guys are very pro-arrhythmogenic, but they are still less pro-arrhythmogenic than 1C, 1A, and 1B. You remember in 1C, we said that it can be very dangerous, right? It can be very dangerous because it can be lethal if it has caused arrhythmia in a patient who had already AMI or ventricular ectopy, right? Okay, so let's not confuse anything. What I wanted to say that, okay, all the antiarrhythmic drugs actually have a risk of developing arrhythmia, okay? And the third class, which is the potassium channel blockers, is one of them. That's enough. Now, let's see what drugs do we have in this category. Now, the dufetilide and the ebutilide, these are very similar drugs, except that the dufetilide is given orally and the ibutilide is given IV. So I made this in red so you can remember it. Now, these two guys, as a potassium channel blockers, okay, so they are pure potassium channel blockers, meaning they only block the potassium channels. They are used for supraventricular arrhythmias, for example, atrial fibrillations and flutters. That's enough. Now, The very important, or the most important actually, drug in this category is the amiodarone. Now, the amiodarone, this is a monster. Why is it a monster? Because this drug does everything. It does everything that all the antiarrhythmic drugs do. How? So we say that this drug belongs to what category? To class 3, which means that it is potassium channel blocker. Now, so this is the first thing. It blocks potassium channels. The second thing, it blocks sodium channels. The third thing, it blocks calcium channels. The fourth thing, it blocks alpha and beta receptors. That's why it is a monster. It blocks all the channels. Okay? Now, where do we use it? Of course, everywhere. Supraventricular, ventricular arrhythmia can be given oral or IV. So, amiodarone connected with the word always, okay, or everything. Let's write next to it everything. Everything. So, how does it function? It functions by every way, by blocking potassium, sodium, calcium, alpha, beta receptor. Now, where do we use it? For what type of arrhythmia? For everything, for supraventriculars and for ventricular arrhythmias. How do we use it? In every type, oral or IV. Okay? Now, it has a slight positive heart effect, but no torsade de pointes. This is even another advantage of the amiodarone, that there is no risk of the torsade de pointes, even though it is blocking the potassium channel and prolonging the repolarization. Okay, although it is expected to form torsade de pointes risk, but by another mechanism, amiodarone somehow it prevents the torsade de pointes. You shouldn't know how does it do that. Just know that there is no torsade de pointes in the amiodarone. Okay. Now the only antiarrhythmic drug with no negative inotropy. We said that it has actually a slight positive heart effect. Okay. It is the only antiarrhythmic drug with no negative ionotropy. Now, the bad thing, so this drug has been very good. There is never a drug that is very good. If it is very good in its function, it is going to be very bad in its side effects. And this is applicable for amiodarone. So, amiodarone, it has a very, very bad extracardiac side effects. And the most important will be the pulmonary fibrosis. Okay, so the patient is going to start feeling dyspnea when you use amiodarone for a long time. Pulmonary fibrosis is the very or the most important side effect of the amiodarone. Now, others are also serious, like the photosensitivity of the skin or hepatic and thyroid dysfunction. Now, why is that? I forgot to mention that the amiodarone it contains iodine. Now, what does this remind you? What hormone in our body contains iodine? You know, the thyroid hormones, right? Now, so the amiodarone it mimics the thyroid hormones, and that's why it can lead to hepatic and thyroid dysfunction. Okay? Now, and it can also lead to hypotension. Now, if a drug causes hypotension, what does this mean? This means that when you're applying the amiodarone, you have to give it very, very slowly to the patient. Okay? Now, you shouldn't give it like fast, a huge dose at once. Now, this drug is very lipophilic, slow accumulation in adipose tissue and other tissue. Um, okay, now the half-life of this drug is very important. The half-life, this is a very, very important point that you're probably 100% gonna be asked about it if you get this topic, that the half-life of the amiodarone is 1 month. Can you imagine that? Now, if this half-life is this long, what can we do? How can we put the amiodarone to the most functioning status as soon as possible? It's always a rule. If the drug has a very long half-life, we always give a loading dose. Always, okay? So this sentence is very important to mention in your exam. Otherwise, you're going to be asked about it definitely, okay? Now, okay, and the amiodarone also, it inhibits a lot of the cytochrome P3A4 and the glycoprotein. Anyway, so these metabolism pathways, and this means that it has a lot of interactions. Okay, now another form of the amiodarone is the so-called dronidarone. What did we do with the dronidarone is we removed the iodine from it, so now it doesn't mimic the thyroid hormones anymore. There is no iodine, and because of that, it has a shorter half-life. Having a shorter half-life, it has less side effects. Okay, When do we use the dronedarone? Only in the atrial fibrillation, not like the amiodarone that we used everywhere. Now, so far we spoke about 4 examples of the class 3 potassium channel blockers. Now the fifth example is the sotalol. Now the sotalol used to be a beta blocker drug, but it has an additional beta receptor blocking action and of course potassium channel blocking, right? Additional beta receptor blocking. Now we said that it was originally a beta receptor blocking, okay? But additionally it will have a potassium channel blocking, okay? And there is a risk of Torsades de Pointes, of course, because it's prolonging the repolarization and it is used orally. Okay, the last drug in this category is the beryllium. Now I think you already know the beryllium, but anyway, it has an additional adrenergic neuron blocking effect, okay? It may lead to hypotension and it is used very rarely IV for ventricular arrhythmias. Okay, so this was about the class 3. Let's go over it again. We say the class 3 are potassium channel blockers. If we block the potassium channels, this means that the repolarization is going to take longer time than normal. Longer time of repolarization means that the automaticity is going to decrease and there is a risk of Torsades de Pointes. We said that these drugs, okay, because they form a risk for Torsades de Pointes, we call them pro-arrhythmogenic. And the examples were the dufetilide, the ibutylide, amiodarone, that blocks everything, it does everything, and then it causes very serious side effects like the pulmonary fibrosis. And the half-life was 1 month with loading dose needed. And then the dronedarone, no iodine, less side effects, atrial fibrillation only, sotalol, additional beta receptor blocking action, and it is used orally, ibritidium, additional adrenergic neuron blocking action, used IV for emergency. Okay, now class 4 is the calcium channel blockers. Now you should already be familiar with this category from the calcium channel video, but okay, let's go over it again. Now what I want to mention before everything, that if we thought about the adrenergic receptors, so the beta receptor for example, how did the beta receptor function? What was the signal transduction pathway of the beta receptor? Beta receptors are G protein coupled, okay? So beta 1 is a G protein stimulatory type, which means that it used to increase the cyclic AMP, right? And the cyclic AMP is going to activate an enzyme called the PKA, the protein kinase A. This protein kinase A is going to facilitate the voltage gated calcium channel, okay? Now, so class 2 was the beta 1 blockers, right? So beta receptor here, it is a G protein coupled receptor, right? This was the class 2. Why am I talking about it now? Because basically class 2 and the class 4 are the same. Why? Because the beta receptors used to function by enhancing voltage gated calcium channels, right? So if we either block the beta receptor or block the calcium channel, it's gonna lead to the same consequences, right? Okay. Now, so the calcium channel. Now let's also remember one thing, that in the nodal tissue, which means in the SA node, in the AV node, we said that they have something like this, right? So the action potential or the depolarization cycle was something like this. That here comes the SDD and then the upstroke phase and then the repolarization, right? Now, where did we have calcium channels in this figure? We had it here. The calcium channels were responsible for the upstroke phase of the nodal tissue, right? So the calcium channel is responsible for the upstroke phase. So we can block them, okay? Now that's why it is used for supraventricular tachyarrhythmias. Now, it binds to both the active and the inactive channels, which means the use dependent and the state dependent. Use dependent and state dependent, okay? Now, and it is gonna, now, we said that it is like the beta blockers, right? The beta blockers used to reduce the slope of the SDD, they used to slow the AV conduction, they used to prevent the EDA and the EAD and the DAD, okay, so the early after depolarization and the delayed after depolarization, so the same thing. And okay, so this part is how the calcium channels are acting the same way as the beta 1 blockers, that they reduce the slope, They slow the AV conduction, they prevent the early and delayed after depolarization and use for the supraventricular tachyarrhythmias. Now, what additional things did we add? That they are going to block the calcium channels that are responsible for the upstroke phase in the nodal tissues, and that they are use dependent and state dependent. Now, and of course, in this case, what drugs are we going to use of the calcium channel types, calcium channel blocker? Of course, the verapamil and the deltaiazem, we wouldn't use the dihydropyridines, right? Because the dihydropyridines are smooth muscle selective. They are not cardiac selective. So we would use the verapamil and the deltaiazem. They can be given orally or IV. Now that's it about the classes of the um, the classes of the Vaughan-Williams classification. So we talked about all of them: the sodium channel blockers, the beta receptor antagonists, the potassium channel blockers, and the calcium channel blockers. But we have drugs that don't really fit in this classification. Okay? Now, so not too many and not complicated, very simple. You should know what a drug, what is it used for, and that's it. Now, if you have watched my pathophysiology video about the arrhythmias, then I said that in one type of the arrhythmia was when there is so much AV block. And we said that in order to reverse that, we can use the atropine. So here, the antiarrhythmic drugs that are not fitting in this classification, the first drug is the atropine. Now, this atropine is a muscarinic antagonist. It is used in case of sinus bradycardia, so the SA is slow, or there is an AV block. Okay? Very simple. If there is an AV block, how can we reverse it? We can use atropine and eliminate the vagal tone, right? Because the vagal tone was slowing the AV node even more, right? So we can use the atropine in order to eliminate the vagal tone on the AV. Now, the isoprenaline is another drug that it is a synthetic catecholamine. It is basically like saying it is noradrenaline, for example, but it is a synthetic form. The isoprenaline, it's may be used in the same situations as the atropine in the sinus bradycardia and the AV block. So if the heart was beating slow, we can use a catecholamine to make it faster, right? So the isoprenaline can do that. But the thing is, comparing the isoprenaline to atropine, isoprenaline carries a risk of developing arrhythmia. Atropine doesn't. Okay? That's the difference between these two guys. Now, digoxin. You already know digoxin as the drug that was used in case of increasing the ionotropy of the heart. So, in case of the end stage heart failure, digoxin and digitoxin, right? Now, digoxin can be used as an antiarrhythmic drug as well because it can be used for atrial fibrillations. It is actually clinically used, the digoxin may be used in atrial fibrillation in patient with systolic heart failure. So if the patient had systolic heart failure, we can increase the positive inotropy by digoxin, and we can also stop the atrial fibrillation in these patients using the digoxin. Okay? Now, the third drug here is the adenosine. Adenosine is very interesting. Why? Because it acts on a receptor called the 1A adenosine receptor. You should know that already from pharmacology 1, but anyway, so the adenosine 1 receptor, it was an inhibitory G protein coupled receptor, right? Now, additionally, the adenosine is going to inhibit the calcium channel and it is going to activate the potassium channel. Now, in where? In the AV node. Now, let's think about it. If we activate the potassium channel in the AV node, this means that the potassium is what? The potassium is leaving the cell. What does that mean? It means that if the potassium is leaving the cell, this means that the cell is going to hyperpolarization, which means that it is not going to be functioning anymore. So this is going to lead to negative dromotropy, right? It is going to lead to negative dromotropy on the heart. It is used to stop the supraventricular tachycardia. Why? Because we slowed the AV conduction, basically. That's why we use it for supraventricular tachycardia, and it is used IV, functions within a minute. It is very, very fast. But the side effects of the adenosine, we can't use it sometimes because it can lead to transient what bronchospasm. You remember the adenosine receptor is also present in the smooth muscles of the bronchi, so it can lead to bronchospasm, which means that it is contraindicated if the patient had what? If the patient had asthma, of course. Now, another thing that it can lead to hypotension. Okay. Now the interactions of the adenosine can be with the caffeine and the theophylline because these guys antagonize the adenosine receptor, and it has also an interaction with the dipyridamole that inhibits the adenosine uptake. You're gonna learn about these drugs later. Okay? Then we have the potassium and magnesium. These ions can be given IV. They are used in torsade de pointes and digitalis induced arrhythmia. So, if for example we used any of the antiarrhythmic drugs and the antiarrhythmic drug itself caused torsade de pointes, what can we do? We can give IV potassium or magnesium. Okay? These ions are also effective even if there is no ion deficiency. So this doesn't mean that we're giving these ions to the patient that the patient is deficient. No, the patient can still have normal levels of potassium and magnesium, but still can be treated with them if they develop torsade de pointes or digitalis induced arrhythmia. Now, the next one is vernaculant. Vernaculant is special. Let me circle it actually because it is special, it is important. Vernaculant, it is atrial selective. This is that a new thing that we never mentioned so far, right? We never said that a drug is atrial selective. So the vernaculant is atrial selective. Now, how is that advantageous? It is advantageous because it has no function on the ventricles, which means there is no risk of arrhythmia. It is a very safe antiarrhythmic drug. Now, how does it work? It is a sodium channel blocker, which dissociates rapidly from the channel, and it also blocks potassium channels involved in the repolarization where in the atrial fibers. So blocking the sodium channels is gonna basically make the upstroke phase slower. Blocking the potassium channel is gonna make the repolarization longer, but where in the atrial fibers, which means that we can use it for what? Atrial fibrillation, of course. And it can be used IV or orally. That's enough about it. It has some side effects like hypotension, dysgeusia, and paresthesia. Anyway, the last drug here is the ivabradine. Ivabradine is not really antiarrhythmic drug, but it is rather a drug that is used in the systolic heart failure. Okay, how does it function? It functions by blocking the funny sodium channel, the one that was responsible for initiating the SDD, the funny current. Okay, that's all about the ivabradine. So out of the Vaughan-Williams classification, we mentioned a couple of drugs. We said the atropine, used in case of the AV block and the slow SA node. The isoprenaline, used in the same way, but it carries a risk of arrhythmia. Digoxin, we said it is used in atrial fibrillation in patients with heart failure. Adenosine, we said it is blocking the calcium channel and opening potassium channel in the AV, causing negative dromotropy, and it is used for supraventricular tachycardia. Can't be given to a patient with asthma or hypotension. And then we said we have potassium and magnesium can be given IV in order to solve the problem like torsade de pointes. Vernaculant is atrial selective. It blocks sodium channels and potassium channels used for atrial fibrillation. And the ivabradine blocking the funny current, not antiarrhythmic drug. It is used for systolic heart failure. So that's all about the antiarrhythmic drugs. I hope you guys have found this video very helpful and I hope that I made it as simple as I could. Good luck and see you in the next.